Hello, it's Grandmama. Welcome to another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, Ned Finch. Hello, we're prying open the scrapbook to a page that I look forward to sharing with you. First, because it's about one of our most colorful of all old-timers, and secondly, because it is about a person and not something less tangible. And people, today or yesterday, make the best stories. Tonight we're going back to talk about Ned Finch. Edward C. Finch to posterity, but Ned Finch to his contemporaries and neighbors, and I guess since we're neighbors at heart, he's Ned Finch to us. The stories that I'm going to tell you about this fabulous man have been pieced together from memory, from the recollections of stories I've heard about him as a child, from close friends of his, and from those who knew him well. In many respects, Ned Finch was probably the nearest thing to a Diamond Jim Brady that the harbor had ever had. His life, even the sketchy portions that we have left to tell about, runs the gamut of colorful, from the sawmill roustabout and knight of the road to oil millionaire and successful promoter. It's the story, you will admit, that could only happen in America. And I'm not sure, but what is a story that could only happen in the rip-roaring, boom sawdust west, of which Grays Harbor was one of the most amazing parts. But let's get on with the story. Old-timers are a little vague about just when Ed Finch came to Grays Harbor, but they all agreed that this was a very young city when he first showed up as Colonel Chumney's saloon, talking in smooth, self-assured way about what he had seen and done. He had ridden the old brake rods of the westbound railroad train into Tacoma and beaten his way down to the harbor in a series of thrusts that were mostly focused on getting Square Mills on time and a dry place to rest his bones at night. To use the parlance of our day, Ed Finch was on his uppers when he came to Grays Harbor. He had no trouble finding work. Soon after he arrived here, he showed up at the J.M. Weatherwax mill and was given a job driving a slab cart. In a few months, he had abandoned that for a real estate venture with the Dabney brothers. In the ensuing years, he promoted, traded, sold, and dealt in almost everything. But in promotion, he shined. There must have been some doubts in his mind as to the future of the harbor, because along in the middle 1890s, he packed off to California and engaged in an oil stock promotion venture that, while it didn't provide him with any great financial benefits, it did give him some experience for what was years later to be the most successful venture of his life. Well, to that in a minute, after a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsors. Well, Ned Finch to the harbor a few times for a visit, and then just after the turn of the century, he came back to his first love and settled down. He had taken on an aura of respectability and importance by this time. Before he went south, he had acquired a wife, and at intervals, he was presented with additions to his family in the form of young daughters. There were finally 3 of them. He had also developed a finesse for promotion that made any venture that Finch's name was connected with of interest to many. Well, he came back to the harbor and was welcomed by all, and within a week he was promoting. He organized the Grays Harbor Electric Company. Oh, there had been a few electric lights before Ed Finch got busy. But this electric company proposed to set up a system of electric streetcars to operate between Cosmopolis, Hoquiam, and Aberdeen, and to provide street lights service to homes, and everything that the magic name of electricity promised. With J. Cray, brothers of E.B. Cray, Dean of Grays Harbor Weather Prophets, Finch set up the concern. He took a block of offices in the Weatherwax Roland building on the corner of Heron and H Street. They advertised that their power was always working. They began to develop a power plant between the two principal cities and interested outside capital. And when the wheels of the new electric company began to turn, Edward C. Finch was its general manager. To some men, this would have been enough. A key job and a going business and plenty of connections, but not Ned Finch. He looked for greater fields. And when he was looking, the town went up in smoke. Yes, he was thinking of new adventures on that very day in October 1903 when fire swept through the wooden city of that day and left what had been Aberdeen a charred and blackened ruin. Among other things, the office of the company and all its contents went up in smoke. Ned stayed with his electric venture just long enough to get it relocated and operating again. Then he set his cap for a big one. The town, he said, needed a real skyscraper. He had picked up the electrical idea in California. Now he proposed to go to work on other big city ideas. A city that was bouncing back from destruction the way Aberdeen was should have a fine new building. Not a 2-story, not a 3-story, not even a 4-story. Ned Finch advocated for a 5-story building. No one took it very seriously at first. Oh, there were 5-story buildings in Seattle and Tacoma, but Aberdeen, way down here in the woods, it was unthinkable. But Ned Finch apprised and was inspired for big things. He took his problems to the Hayes and Hayes Bank, where Billy Patterson presided over the acquisitions. He laid the plan out, and if there was common ground on which these two men could meet, it was here. For Billy Patterson, regardless of what might have been said of his lack of physical caution, held one thing above all others. What is good for Grays Harbor is good for Hayes and Hayes Bank. Billy thought it an excellent scheme, but he wanted to see it all laid out on paper. Get a plan, he told Finch. Find out what it will cost, then come back. That took some doing. There were architects to retain, some experimental work to do. People were confident that the muddy tide flats couldn't support a 5-story building. It'll sink into the mud, they told each other. But the architects had seen tide flats before, and when the test pilings had been driven, the plans finished, and estimates made, Finch again confronted Patterson with his proposal. Print some stock, and we'll hold it, Patterson told the promoter, and Finch did just that. He formed a corporation, issued stock, and left most of it in the vault at Hayes and Hayes as he met the monthly payments on the rising structure. Jim Fuller, one of Grays Harbor's keen-eyed old-timers who recalls the fast-moving early years of Grays Harbor with many a chuckle, recalled the other day that we had the stock around for the longest time, but it paid out. Finch made it go, and Aberdeen had the pride of Southwest Washington, a real 5-story building with an elevator. It put the city in a class by itself. Some old-timers think it did more to stabilize the city than any other one thing. It gave it the look of security, they say. People weren't afraid to invest in a town that had a 5-story building with an electric elevator. And speaking of the Finch building, it reminds me of the story my old dad used to tell us about Finch. It's not unusual to find temperament in a man of Finch's ability, and Finch had it. He had pride, ability, and a terrific temper, someone once said. Anyhow, when Ned Finch was securely situated in his big office behind the plate glass windows of his building, it was not uncommon for people in the town to drop in, just a pleasantry call, and tell him what a fine thing he had done for the town. He took pleasure in showing them around. One question, however, was commonly asked, and answering the question became a chore for the promoter. The question was asked by many. "Ned, you've got a beautiful building here, but why did you put the main entrance around here on the side street?" Well, Finch would explain, the Heron Street front was valuable for business purposes, for stores and other uses. The side street was longer and less valuable, so architects had decided to use the side street for the office entrance. Now, Dr. Seth Maker, a dentist, turned publisher, turned town clown, noticed how many people asked this question when he was in Finch's office. So one morning, he primed a half-dozen friends of the promoter to go in singly and make the identical remark, after each had noted the beautiful building and asked about the side entrance. Finch laboriously explained the reason for it. Then another would come in, and then another for explanation. Finally, when the fourth caller said, "Ned, you've got a fine building here, but why did you put the main entrance on the side street?" Finch roared like a wild bull, seized a tall brass cuspidor and fired it at the inquisitor. And you guessed it, took out one of his large and expensive plate glass windows with a resounding crash. Well, from five-story buildings, Finch went on to other ventures. He was an active lodge man, playing quite a role in the Elks. He had a feeling for the spinning roulette wheel. His fingers itched for the feel of a royal flush or a full house. In that respect, as well as most others, Ned Finch was the perfect type of Western promoter. If he had a creed, it was easy come, easy go. There was, for example, the time when young J. Weatherwax was given a check by his elder brother and told to hurry east to the bedside of his stricken father. That would have been J.M., after whom the school was named. But Jay met up with Ned Finch, and after some due consideration, they tried to swell the amount of the young man's travel fund with the mysterious pasteboards. It didn't work. When the long evening was over, the entire amount was gone. There was also a problem to face. Jay must get east. He had been informed that his father was desperately ill, perhaps dying. The two unlucky card players considered their situation, and Finch drew on his vast fund of experience at such things. He knew a way to break the game. They'd work it, not here, but in Seattle. So they hired off to the big city. They tried their system on a small scale, and it worked. The account got bigger. To avoid any suspicion that might result from breaking the bank, they took small profits and went from place to place, increasing the travel fund. Finch suggested that they try Everett. They made the trip to Everett by boat and selected the most likely of several spots for their next experiment. And again, their system worked. It worked so well and so easily that temptation proved too much for them. They went on piling up the chips until they broke the bank, then elbowed their way through the excited crowd with a small fortune. As they walked out the doors, they felt the keen eyes of management boring into their backs. They wasted no time. Finch was not one to run from a promotion, but this time distance seemed the greater part of valor. He hurried to the docks, but there were no boats before morning. In those days, no such things as buses moved over the narrow roads in Seattle, so they tried the railroad. No train till 7 a.m., they were told. It seemed their last chance. But those who knew Ed Finch would never doubt that he could find a way out, and he did. "Can we rent a locomotive?" he asked the station agent, and waved a cow-chalking wad of greenbacks under his nose. They could, and they did. They rented a locomotive, and with an engineer ordered to get them back to Seattle at full speed, they made the city limits of Everett ahead of the gang the gambling hall bosses had organized to take care of them. Yes, Jay got back to Michigan to his father's bedside before the patriarch breathed his last breath. And Finch came back to the harbor and no doubt invested in something amazing with his share of the winnings. I said Ned Finch had a terrible temper. It got him into a lot of fights. So far, most old-timers can recall he never won a fight, but it was always a full-fledged battle when Ned was in one with his opponent. There was the night he fought Charlie Johnson, but that's another story, a story that must go together with the story of Ned Finch's big strike, the one that made him a millionaire almost overnight. We'll spin that yarn tomorrow night when we meet again and read the story of Ned Finch from our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.